The subway was late again. Ava Bennett stood on the freezing platform of the Brooklyn station, clutching the strap of her worn leather bag like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The December wind howled through the tunnels, a sharp, impatient gust that sliced through her thin coat and bit at her skin. She barely even flinched. She was used to the cold, unfortunately. Her phone buzzed yet again. "Ava, rent is overdue," the landlord's text blared. "Second time today. Third time this week." Ava took a deep breath, trying to tamp down the rising tide of panic in her chest. She couldn't think about that now. She absolutely couldn't allow herself to. Not when all her energy was focused on simply surviving the next few hours. She checked the time, 11:02 p.m. She had a mere 37 minutes to get across town and somehow convince the night shift at the 24-hour bakery in East Harlem to let her work. If she missed this train, if she missed this opportunity, she wouldn't just lose the shift. She'd lose the wages that came with it. And if she lost those wages, well, she didn't even want to go there. The platform slowly filled with the usual cast of characters, commuters and oddballs, the tired, the drunk, the invisible. She scanned for an empty seat, but there were none to be found. Instead, she leaned against the cold concrete wall and closed her eyes for just a second, a micro moment of respite. She hadn't slept in almost 2 days. The faint rumble of an approaching train snapped her eyes open. She squeezed through the crowd, wedging herself into the last subway car just as the doors slammed shut behind her with a metallic bang. Inside, the train was packed tighter than a sardine can. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their coats brushing against each other, their eyes glazed over with exhaustion. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, humming their weary, monotonous tune. Ava glanced around at the rows of seats. There was only one empty spot left. And next to that empty spot was a man who looked like he'd just stepped out of the pages of a business magazine. A charcoal suit tailored to flawless perfection, dark hair neatly combed, and a hardcover book open on his lap. It defied all logic what someone like him was doing on a train like this. He did this once a year, in remembrance of his deceased sister, who used to take this line every day. Ava hesitated, then slid into the seat beside him. She mumbled a quiet, "Thanks." Although he didn't so much as flinch, the man didn't even look up, didn't even blink. His eyes remained glued to the pages in his hands. She didn't know why, but that somehow made her calmer than she thought she would be. And for the first time in days, the storm raging in her chest quieted just enough to let exhaustion finally take over. Her eyelids felt heavy. The screech of the rails became a lullaby, a strange sort of comfort. And somewhere between Union Square and 86th Street, Ava Bennett, a girl who felt like she had nothing left to lose, fell asleep on a stranger's shoulder. Ethan Ward didn't move. He felt her head rest gently against his shoulder just after 34th Street. The shift was so subtle that another person probably wouldn't have even noticed. But he did. He noticed everything. It was part of who he was, what made him both dangerous in boardrooms and indispensable in billion-dollar negotiations. A mind meticulously trained to track every variable, a life lived to analyze and mitigate risk. And yet, he didn't move. He really should have. He knew that if someone had told him even 12 hours prior that he would allow a complete stranger, a downright disheveled one at that, to sleep on his shoulder during a late-night train ride, he would have laughed right in their face. But there was something about her that stopped him. Maybe it was the way she clutched her bag, as if it contained something incredibly precious. Maybe it was the way her shoulders were hunched, as if life had dealt her too many blows and she had learned to guard herself by sheer instinct. Or maybe it was the way she didn't try to apologize, didn't force a conversation. She just rested, trusting him without demanding that he earn it. It shouldn't have meant anything. He was Ethan Ward, CEO of Devu International, a name whispered in hushed tones in exclusive waiting rooms and behind closed doors. A man who sat on more boards than he had friends, who bought companies like some people casually bought coffee. He didn't trust easily. He didn't believe in accidents. But as the train rumbled through the darkened belly of New York, he let her sleep. And for reasons he didn't yet fully understand, he didn't want the ride to end. The train jolted slightly, but Ava didn't wake. Her breath was soft, shallow, and warm against the fine fabric of Ethan's coat. Now she had slumped a little farther into him, blissfully unaware that her cheek was pressed against the shoulder of one of the wealthiest, most elusive men in New York City. Ethan didn't move. He didn't sigh. He didn't even blink. He simply watched the fleeting reflections play across the opposite window. His mind was unusually still quiet. Ava murmured something in her sleep, something almost like a whisper. Ethan tilted his head slightly, listening intently. "Riley, don't forget the milk," she said before letting out a soft chuckle and falling silent again. It caught him off guard. He wasn't used to moments like these. Small, unpolished glimpses into someone else's life that unfolded before him without pretense, without a mask. He was used to control, to carefully constructed contracts, to women who knew who he was before they even knew who he was. But this was different. He looked down at her again. Her makeup was long faded, and her hair was a little mess from the wind. Her coat was thin, her shoes were scuffed, and her fingers were faintly stained with ink or maybe food service dye. She was clearly exhausted. He could see it etched into every line of her face. But she didn't look defeated. She looked resilient. The train began to slow, screeching as it approached 86th Street. She didn't stir. Ethan felt the weight of the changing time, the growing awareness of what he had to do. He should get off the train soon. His car would be waiting at the Lexington Avenue exit, and his assistant was tracking his location every second. He already had 3 missed calls, 2 from a board member, 1 from his sister in London. But still, he didn't move, not until Ava stirred, her eyelids fluttering, her eyes slowly opening. She paused, realizing where her head had been resting. Her body jolted upright, as if she'd been burned. An unmistakable blush instantly bloomed across her cheeks. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to," she stammered, pulling her coat collar higher, her hands flailing as if she could somehow erase the last 30 minutes. Ethan turned to her, his expression calm, his voice low and even. "You were tired. I drooled on your coat." She looked down, mortified. Negligible damage. Ava buried her face in her hands. "This is officially the most mortifying moment of my adult life." A slow, genuine, not at all patronizing half-smile spread across Ethan's face. "Then I'd say, you're doing pretty well." Ava peeked at him through her fingers, something unreadable flashing in her eyes. For the first time, she really looked at him, really saw his posture, his suit, the gleaming watch on his wrist, the way he occupied space like a man who owned everything around him without needing to prove it. And yet, he wasn't recoiling. She cleared her throat, smoothing down her coat. "Thanks for not freaking out or, reporting me to the nearest MTA employee." Ethan shrugged, his shoulder still feeling the faint imprint of her head. "No harm done." She hesitated. "You have no idea how rare kindness is on these trains." "Have some idea," he said quietly. They sat there in silence for a moment, the train pulling into the next stop. Ava clutched her bag, preparing to get up, but something held her back, something unspoken. She looked at him again. "Ava," she said, extending her hand as if it was a test. "Ethan," he replied, taking her hand with a firm but warm grip. Ava studied him again, her eyes slightly narrowed, as if she was trying to connect invisible dots in her mind. "You don't seem like a subway kind of guy. You don't seem like a falling asleep on strangers kind of girl," Ethan countered, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Touché." The train began to slow again. Ethan stood first, grabbing his bag. Ava followed. As they stepped off the train and towards the turnstiles, the cold air smacked her cheeks, pulling her back to reality. She looked at him again. The warmth of the train had already begun to dissipate. "Well, thanks again, Ethan, for being nice. It's rarer than it should be." He nodded, pausing as if he wanted to say something more, as if there were words lingering on the tip of his tongue. But then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of weary New Yorkers, her coat vanishing like smoke between bodies, swallowed by a city that never noticed when people slipped through its cracks. Ethan stood motionless, unmoving on the platform, and for the first time in years, he didn't know why he cared that she was gone. Ethan didn't leave the platform immediately. For a man whose entire life operated with meticulous precision, his feet seemed almost rooted to the concrete. Ava, the name echoed in his head, long after she disappeared into the blur of coats and footsteps. It wasn't just the way she looked at him, half embarrassed, half amused. It was something else, something deeper, more raw, more human. His driver was waiting just outside the station, in a sleek black car, the leather interior warm and inviting, the kind of silent bubble where people like Ethan conducted billion-dollar deals without batting an eye. He slid into the back seat, his expression unreadable. "Back to the penthouse, sir?" the driver asked. Ethan's eyes flicked out the window. The city blurred past, full of strangers with stories he never had the time to learn. "No," he said quietly. "Take me to the office." The driver nodded, asking no questions. But even as the skyline shifted, even as the Callahan Tower loomed ever closer through the tinted glass, Ethan's mind wasn't on the upcoming board meeting or the pending merger with the Zurich firm, but on a girl in a threadbare coat who had fallen asleep on his shoulder without even knowing who he was. Ava didn't think about Ethan anymore, at least not right away. She had too many other things weighing on her mind. The instant she stepped into the fluorescent-lit grocery store on 94th Street, the warmth of the train was completely gone, replaced by the chill of reality. She rummaged in her bag, counting out her change with the meticulous precision that came from living paycheck to paycheck. She skipped the eggs, opting for Gennaro pasta and tomato sauce instead. She lingered by the milk cooler, then moved on altogether, knowing it just wasn't in the budget. By the time she reached the checkout, she had calculated and recalculated every item in her basket, making sure she wouldn't be short. But it was the cashier's voice that pulled her from her mental calculations. "Rough day?" Ava blinked. What had given her away? The cheap ramen or the perpetually stressed expression etched on her face? The cashier smiled sympathetically. "I worked the night shift." I recognized the look. Ava chuckled wearily, sliding her crumpled bills across the counter. "Just trying to make it through the week." A pause hung in the air. "You know," the cashier said, slowly bagging her groceries, "you look like someone who used to smile more." Ava stiffened slightly, then nodded, her gaze averted. "Yeah, I used to." She didn't say anything else. She didn't explain that just a year ago, she was in her final semester of art school, that she had a full scholarship, a detailed plan, a portfolio brimming with dreams. She didn't explain how her father's sudden stroke had changed everything, irrevocably altering the course of her life. How she had dropped out, moved back home, and started working double shifts to help pay the mounting medical bills that threatened to drown them both. She didn't explain because no one needed to know, especially strangers. Especially a man like Ethan Ward. Except now, ironically, she couldn't seem to stop thinking about him. The way he hadn't flinched when she woke up on his shoulder, the way he had looked at her like she wasn't completely invisible. That night, after making a simple dinner for her father and carefully helping him into bed, Ava finally had a moment to herself. She sat on the fire escape with a worn blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the city sigh and groan below. Her phone buzzed, a news alert. * New York Newswire. Callahan Global to complete $3 billion tech acquisition this quarter. She rolled her eyes. Predictable. She skimmed the headline without actually opening the article, but not before she saw the attached photo. Ethan stepping out of a sleek black car, surrounded by reporters, his face obscured by the flashing lights. Still that same calm expression. Still that unbelievably tailored suit. But in the photo, he looked colder, untouchable, nothing like the man who had offered her a beverage after she had drooled on his impeccable coat. Ava stuffed her phone back inside her sweatshirt, banishing the image from her mind. She didn't know who Ethan Ward really was, and she certainly didn't expect to ever see him again. But fate, especially in New York, had a strange and often cruel sense of humor. The next time Ava saw Ethan Ward, it wasn't in a gleaming boardroom or splashed across some billion-dollar headline. It was at Westbridge General Hospital, and it was the last place either of them expected to run into each other. Ava was crammed into the crowded elevator, clutching a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee with a cracked lid and a precarious stack of patient files. Volunteer run. Free of charge, she reminded herself. Her shoes were soaked from the slush outside, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that hadn't seen a comb all day. She hadn't even looked in a mirror, to be honest. She was tired, bone-tired. She was always tired lately. Her father's physical therapy appointments had been pushed up a week, and now she was juggling those appointments with her evening shift at the bookstore, barely staying afloat. Volunteering at the hospital wasn't even paid, of course, but it gave her access to a quiet break room where she could steal a few moments of peace. And more importantly, it gave her a staff badge that made things significantly easier when navigating the labyrinthine corridors of her father's rehabilitation wing. She didn't see Ethan at first, lost in her own thoughts, but he saw her. He was standing near the nurse's station, holding a delicate bouquet of white calla lilies, talking quietly to an older woman in a navy cardigan. His mother, Ava realized with a jolt of recognition. She had seen her in a magazine once. Margaret Ward, former opera singer, current president of the Callahan Foundation, and by all accounts, the steely spine behind her son's sprawling empire. It wasn't until Ava stepped off the elevator and turned towards the hallway that Ethan fully turned around and paused, his expression momentarily frozen. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway. A beat passed, then another longer. He said nothing, and neither did she, but something undeniably flickered across his face. Recognition, surprise, something subtly warmer. Ava instinctively tried to walk past him, feigning obliviousness, hoping to simply disappear into the bustling hospital. But Ethan spoke first, his voice cutting through the noise. Ava. She slowly turned back, her lips parting slightly in surprise. Hi, she said quietly, caught somewhere between acute embarrassment and utter bewilderment. You're here, he said, then immediately cringed, realizing how awkward his words sounded. I mean, are you okay? She gave a small, awkward laugh, trying to diffuse the sudden tension that had sprung up between them. I could ask you the same thing, she replied, her cheeks flushed. He nodded slowly. My mother is here for a few follow-up scans. His voice softened slightly as he spoke about his mother. You? My father, Ava said, her eyes dropping to the floor. He's been recovering here since last fall. Stroke, complications, long story. Ethan's expression noticeably changed. The carefully constructed business mask slipped just enough to reveal something else underneath, something genuinely human. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and he actually meant it. Ava shrugged a shoulder, trying to downplay the situation. We're managing. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. You work here? She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. I volunteer between jobs. Well, technically I have one job, just not one that actually pays the bills. Ethan looked at her intently, and for the first time in weeks, Ava didn't feel like she was simply an extra in someone else's life. She felt seen, acknowledged. Do you? He started, then paused, carefully choosing his next words. Would you want to have lunch with me? Ava blinked, taken aback. Now? He glanced at his watch. If you're free, there's a cafeteria on the 3rd floor. I was going to grab a coffee anyway. She really should have refused. She was exhausted, she was stressed, and she certainly didn't belong in his meticulously curated world. But something in the way he was looking at her, like she was the most unexpected and perhaps even welcome thing to happen to him all day, made her nod before her brain could quite catch up. Okay, she said quietly, almost to herself. They walked in silence at first, the air thick with unspoken words. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor was punctuated only by the soft ding of the bell and the monotonous humming of the fluorescent lights. But once they sat down at a quiet table tucked away in the corner of the bustling hospital cafeteria, the strained silence finally broke. Ethan ordered them both tea. Ava didn't even particularly like tea, but when the warm paper cup warmed her palms, it felt like an olive branch, a small offering of comfort. I didn't expect to see you again, Ethan said finally, breaking the ice. Ava gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. I figured you'd forgotten about me, the second the train pulled into the station. He shook his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. No, I remembered. Something in his tone made her look up, meet his eyes directly. You fell asleep on my shoulder, he added almost playfully, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. It's hard to forget that. Ava smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. You didn't exactly push me off. No, Ethan admitted, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I didn't want to. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts, and then she said, her voice soft but firm. You didn't tell me who you were. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. Would it have mattered if I had? Ava didn't answer immediately, but the truth was it absolutely would have, because men like Ethan Ward simply didn't exist in her world. And if she had known who he was from the start, she never would have let her guard down long enough to fall asleep on his shoulder. But now it was too late to pretend she wasn't curious, too late to rewind and make a different choice. She looked at him for a long moment, really taking him in. The impeccable suit, the expensive watch, the way he observed everything quietly without needing to say much. He was undeniably calm, undeniably powerful, and undeniably intimidating in the way that people with too much control often were. But he was also here with her, sitting in a cheap plastic chair under flickering cafeteria lights, asking questions as if he actually wanted the answers, as if her opinions mattered. What are you really doing? Where are we? She finally asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Ethan considered her for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. I'm not entirely sure, he said honestly, but maybe I wanted to see what happens when someone doesn't care that I'm a billionaire. Ava scoffed softly, a hint of amusement in her voice. Careful. That sounds dangerously close to sincerity. Ethan chuckled softly, a genuine sound. Don't tell anyone, he said, a playful glint in his eyes. It would ruin my carefully cultivated reputation. She took a tentative sip of her tea. It was too hot, too bitter, too weak. But she didn't mind, not today. Because for the first time in a long time, Ava wasn't just going through the motions, just barely surviving. She was genuinely curious again, even dare she admit it, hopeful. And Ethan Ward, the stranger on the train who wasn't quite a stranger anymore, was sitting across from her like he wasn't in a rush to be anywhere else in the world. Ava had absolutely no intention of seeing Ethan again the next day. She really didn't. But the universe, or perhaps something far messier and more stubbornly human, clearly had other plans in store for her. It was a bleak Friday afternoon, and the sky outside the hospital windows had turned an ugly, oppressive shade of steel gray. Ava had just finished logging her volunteer hours and was heading toward the exit, her mind already racing with a list of things she needed to do, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Ava. She turned around, her heart skipping a beat. Ethan was standing near the revolving doors, wearing a soft gray sweater and dark jeans. He looked far less like a billionaire CEO and more like the kind of guy you might see on a lazy Sunday morning in Central Park, casually holding a coffee, not carrying the crushing weight of an entire business empire on his shoulders. Ava blinked in surprise. Do you live around here? Ethan smiled slightly, a hint of playfulness in his eyes. I was hoping I'd run into you again. Ava raised an eyebrow, skeptically. Are you staking me out of the hospital? He laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. Just good timing, I assure you. My mother was discharged this morning, and, well, I lingered just in case I happen to pass through the lobby and see you. Something like that. Ava folded her arms across her chest, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. She really should have just walked away right then and there. She should have told him she didn't have time for games, not when the bills were piling up and her father needed her undivided attention. But she didn't walk away, and that was because a small, reckless part of her desperately wanted to know what would happen next, what this unexpected encounter might lead to. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I know this sounds crazy, he said, his voice soft and sincere, but I haven't stopped thinking about that train ride. About you. She stared at him, trying to decipher his intentions. Men like Ethan simply didn't do this. They didn't track down girls who fell asleep on their shoulders. They didn't casually show up at hospitals for impromptu, second conversations. And yet, here he was, defying all expectations. Ava swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Why? Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes searching. Because you didn't ask me for anything. You didn't even know who I was. You weren't trying to get something from me. You were just you. She looked away, unable to hold his intense gaze. You don't even know me, she said softly. Then let me fix that, Ethan said, his voice low and persuasive. Have dinner with me. Ava hesitated, her mind racing. Everything inside her screamed that this was undeniably dangerous, that this wasn't just a simple date, but rather the chaotic intersection of two lives that were never meant to meet in the first place. But she also vividly remembered how she had felt on that train. Strangely safe, undeniably seen, and for the first time in what felt like forever, genuinely curious. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But I picked the place. Ethan grinned, a flash of genuine pleasure lighting up his face. Deal. That night, Ava didn't take him to some pretentious rooftop restaurant where a faceless five-star chef toiled away in anonymity. She took him to a hole-in-the-wall noodle shop on the corner of 58th Street and Hartwell, a place where the tables were a little sticky, the fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, and the soup was undeniably amazing. When Ethan walked inside, he didn't flinch, didn't wrinkle his nose at the worn, laminated menu or the cracked vinyl booths. He simply sat down like he belonged there, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ava watched him carefully, scrutinizing his every move. What? Ethan asked, noticing her intense gaze. He was actually surprised by how easily he could adapt to different situations, how effortlessly he could blend in despite his upbringing. Ethan stirred his tea thoughtfully. Most people automatically assume I grew up in marble hallways and attending caviar tastings. They tend to forget that I'm still, at my core, from Queens. Ava blinked in surprise. You're from Queens? He nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. Born in Jackson Heights. My dad was a mechanic who worked tirelessly to provide for our family, and my mom sang in the church choir before anyone ever saw her on a grand opera stage. Ava didn't know quite what to say. So there, Ethan continued, breaking the momentary silence. I actually do know how to use chopsticks properly, and I also know better than to order the shrimp here. She laughed, a light and genuine sound, and for a brief moment, everything between them felt easy, uncomplicated. The meal passed in quiet conversation about their work, their families, their favorite music, and childhood memories that had absolutely nothing to do with power or money. Ethan asked thoughtful questions, but he didn't pry, didn't push her to reveal anything she wasn't comfortable sharing. And when Ava talked about her father, about his devastating stroke and the challenging aftermath, he simply listened, really listened, with genuine empathy. There was no pity, no faux concern, just quiet presence. After dinner, they walked a few blocks in the biting cold. The streets were slick with melting snow, and Ava shoved her hands deep into her coat pockets to try and keep warm. You never actually told me what you do, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Ava glanced at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. You Googled me, didn't you? And came up empty. I didn't Google you, he protested, though his cheeks flushed slightly. Ava raised an eyebrow, skeptically. Okay, he admitted with a sheepish grin. I Googled you once. You're surprisingly not easy to find online. I work part-time at a bookstore to pay the bills, and I write sometimes when I can find the time and the energy. Freelance essays mostly, and some short stories that nobody actually reads. Ethan looked genuinely intrigued. Why don't you pursue it full-time? Why not dedicate yourself entirely to your writing? Ava shrugged, a touch of weariness in her voice. Life, I guess. Rent, family, the relentless pressure of responsibilities. I had to put my dreams aside, at least for now. He looked at her intently, his gaze unwavering. What would you write if you could write anything you wanted? What kind of stories would you tell? Ava hesitated, considering his question carefully. Stories that make people feel something, that remind them that they're not invisible, that they're not alone in this world. Ethan's voice was soft, almost a whisper. You're not invisible, Ava. She looked away, but not before he caught the briefest glimpse of emotion flickering in her eyes. When they arrived at her subway station, she came to a halt. This is me, she announced. Ethan nodded. Can I see you again? Ava didn't answer right away. The wind howled around them, tugging at her scarf, swirling icy air around her face. Yes, she whispered. Ethan smiled, It wasn't the manufactured billionaire smile plastered on magazine covers. It was something softer, something more genuine. She turned and hurried down the subway steps, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, because she had no clue what this was or where it was headed. But for once, she desperately wanted to find out. 3 days crawled by before Ethan texted her again. It wasn't as if she wasn't constantly on his mind. He was. Constantly. He had board meetings that demanded his presence, limousines in which he was expected to be chauffeured, even a breakfast engagement with some tech founder trying to peddle him yet another AI startup. But he'd made a promise to himself that he wouldn't push, wouldn't smother her. Ava wasn't someone you could force into a corner. She was someone you needed to give the space and time to emerge until she decided to let you stay. His text was simple and to the point, still thinking about that soup. Free tonight? Ava stared at the message longer than she probably should have. Her fingers danced hesitantly over the keypad. A whirlwind of thoughts battled for dominance in her mind. Overdue bills. Her dad's new medication causing unpleasant side effects. A deadline she was already 2 days late on. But she also couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's smile, his eyes, the way he'd listened to her so intently without trying to solve all her problems. So, she typed back, "Only if you promise. No paparazzi." His reply arrived almost instantaneously. "Just me, no flashbulbs." This time they agreed to meet outside a coffee shop in Soho. Nothing pretentious, just a comfortable, familiar spot with 2 strong espressos and a wall lined with well-loved books. Ethan was already there when she arrived, wearing a soft navy peacoat that made him look more like a college professor than a titan of industry. She approached him cautiously, half expecting to find him glued to his phone or surrounded by a swarm of managers. But he wasn't. He stood up the moment he spotted her, his smile relaxed and genuine. "You came," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "You texted," Ava retorted, matching his tone. They ordered 2 lattes and settled into a booth in the back, tucked away from the window. It was quiet, cozy, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. And for the next hour, they simply talked. Not about money, not about her dad's health issues or his astronomical net worth, or the seemingly unbridgeable gap between their lives. They talked about their favorite books, about the ideal type of pastry, about how New York winters were the cruelest kind of emotional trick, snow one day, balmy 65 degrees the next. Ava laughed more freely than she had in weeks, and Ethan looked at her as if she was the most important person in the entire world. Then, just as the conversation began to lull, Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Ava," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate level. "Can I ask you something real?" She met his gaze. "Only if you're ready for a real answer. Why don't you trust people?" Ava blinked. The words struck her with more force than she had anticipated. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lowered her gaze to her mug, tracing the rim with her finger. "Because people leave," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I've spent the last 3 years watching everyone I depended on disappear the second things got difficult. Because it's safer not to expect anything from anyone." Ethan remained silent. She kept her eyes fixed on her mug, still tracing the rim. Not right away, but when she finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed. There was no pity in his eyes, only something gentle, something unwavering. "I'm not going to disappear," he said. She stared at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "You don't know what you're promising." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I mean it anyway." The silence between them deepened, thick with all the unspoken words that hung in the air. And in that moment, Ava realized something terrifying. She wanted to believe him. They left the coffee shop as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a breathtaking display of gold and violet hues. Ethan offered her his arm. Half joking, half serious, she accepted. As they walked toward the subway, Ava asked, "Why me?" Ethan glanced at her. "I meet thousands of people every month," he said. "Most of them want something. And you don't. You just fell asleep on my shoulder." Ava smiled. "It wasn't my finest moment." "It was mine," Ethan replied. They stopped outside her subway stop. Ava hesitated. She could go home now, back to her familiar reality. The cramped apartment, the paltry paycheck, a father who might forget her name one day. Or if she could take a chance and do the things that she never allowed herself to do. Stay a little longer. Do you want to see where I grew up? She asked abruptly. Ethan blinked, clearly taken aback. What? My neighborhood. It's not like your world, but I don't know. Maybe it'll make me less scary. You're the least scary person I've ever met, Ethan said. Trust me, Ava muttered. Where I'm from will humble you. He smiled. Then let's go. And just like that, the billionaire followed the bookseller underground into a part of the city that didn't sparkle, didn't try to hide its broken windows or neglected corners. A place that smelled of mouth-watering street tacos, damp pavement after a rain, and the lingering scent of faded hope. Ava led him past doorways plastered with graffiti, past stoops where elderly men played chess and engaged in heated debates about baseball. They stopped outside a brownstone with cracked steps and a broken doorbell. This is me, she said softly. I grew up here until I was 17. Then we had to move because the roof caved in and the landlord refused to fix it. He was silent, absorbing the scene. I just wanted you to see it, Ava said, her voice even softer now. This is where I'm from. Not charity galas or luxurious penthouses. Just this. Ethan turned to face her. It's a part of you. That's what makes it beautiful. Ava blinked, surprised by his words. You're really not what I expected. Neither are you. They stood in silence for another beat. Then, Ava said, Come on, I'll take you to the train. But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he said, Ava, can I take you somewhere next time? She tilted her head, a question in her eyes. Somewhere? Not dinner. Nothing fancy. Just my place. Ava held her breath, her pulse quickening. Your place? Just to talk, he added quickly, sensing her hesitation. To show you my world. No strings, no assumptions, just you and me and a bottle of wine or coffee or tea, whatever you want. Ava hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay. And just like that, a boundary that had once seemed insurmountable, a division between their worlds defined by his money, her fears, his prominent name, her sense of inadequacy, blurred a little more. She didn't know where this was going, but she was increasingly willing to find out. 3 nights later, Ava stood in front of a soaring glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, feeling as though she'd been transported to an alien planet without a guide. Ethan's building didn't simply reach for the sky. It seemed to glitter with an almost arrogant confidence, as if it had something to prove. Every window shimmered with quiet wealth. Every line in its design was sleek, intentional, and undoubtedly expensive. The doorman greeted her by name. That alone made her stomach clench with nervousness. She wasn't accustomed to being expected. The elevator ride was silent and smooth. Each floor that passed felt like a countdown to something she wasn't at all certain she was prepared for. When the doors finally parted, it wasn't to a generic hallway. It was directly into Ethan's penthouse. He was there waiting, dressed in a charcoal sweater that somehow intensified the striking blue of his eyes. Ava took a steadying breath, carefully masking it behind a neutral smile. You made it? Ethan said, his voice warm and welcoming. You asked, she replied, mirroring his tone. She stepped inside slowly, her senses overwhelmed. The apartment was absolutely enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views. Raw concrete walls gave it an almost industrial edge, and the artwork looked like it belonged in a prestigious gallery, not someone's private residence. But despite its grandeur, it wasn't cold or sterile. There were stacks of books piled haphazardly in corners, a worn leather jacket casually draped over a chair, and a record player spinning something soft and melodic in the background, filling the space with warmth. This place is ridiculous, Ava said, half laughing in disbelief. I know, Ethan admitted, a hint of amusement in his voice. But I like the view. Ava walked to the window and gazed down. The city glittered far below, a dazzling expanse of scattered diamonds. But it wasn't the panoramic skyline that truly captivated her attention. It was the profound silence. Up here, the relentless chaos of the city faded away. No blaring sirens, no incessant traffic noise, just the vast expanse of the sky. You don't talk much about your world, Ava said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Neither do you," Ethan replied, turning to face her. She looked at him, a challenge in her eyes. "I showed you mine." He nodded in acknowledgement. "Fair enough." He set his wine glass down and walked over to a hidden bookshelf in the corner of the room. From it, he retrieved a framed photograph. He handed it to her. It was a picture of Ethan, much younger, perhaps 19 or 20, standing in front of a small, unremarkable brick building. His hair was longer, his clothes were less expensive, but his eyes held the same intensity and unwavering gaze. "Brooklyn," he said, "one bedroom, no heat in the winter. Mom was a nurse. Dad worked in a textile mill until his back gave out." Ava blinked, surprised by this revelation. "You weren't born into this." Ethan shook his head. "No, I built Callahan Holdings from scratch, starting with an old laptop in a borrowed basement office. It took 5 years to get anyone to take me seriously, 10 to pay off all the debt. The first time I ever saw a private plane, I was cleaning it." Ava stared at him, absorbing this new information. Ethan smiled faintly. "Money doesn't change where you come from. It just makes people forget to ask." She handed the photograph back to him gently. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice soft. "Because you're not just passing through, Ava, and I don't want to be just a dream for you. I want to be real." Ava's chest tightened. No one had ever said those words to her before. Not her ex-boyfriend, not the guys who flirted with her in train stations and forgot her name the next day. No one had ever truly wanted to be real to her. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, referring to the complex dynamic between them. "You and me." Ethan's voice was soft and reassuring. "Neither do I, but I know I don't want it to end." Ava exhaled slowly, the warm glass still clutched in her hand. "Then don't lie to me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't. Don't promise things you can't keep. I don't. Don't disappear when things get hard." "I never learned how to run," Ethan replied, his voice filled with conviction, and something in his tone made her believe him. She looked up at him, and he met her gaze without hesitation. No blinking, no flinching. It felt like standing on the edge of something dangerous. And for the first time in a long time, Ava didn't want to step back. She wanted to fall. That night, they didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Instead, they sat side by side on the oversized couch and told each other stories. He told her about a deal he'd walked away from because the CEO had lied about how they treated their employees. She told him about the summer she worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford a single day off. They talked about loss, about pressure, about the dreams they had once buried. At some point during the evening, she leaned her head against his shoulder, not because she was falling asleep this time, but simply to rest. And Ethan didn't move. He just remained there, as solid and dependable as a rock, while the city quietly spun beneath them. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows like golden knives. Ava woke slowly, not on the couch, but wrapped in a soft blanket, with a glass of water and a handwritten note placed on the coffee table. The handwriting was clean and precise. "Didn't want to wake you. Meeting at 6 a.m. Fresh croissants in the kitchen. Coffee to the left. Don't overthink, Ethan." Ava stared at the note for a long time, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. Her chest ached, but not with pain. It was something different, something quieter, something potentially dangerous. By the time she arrived home, her inbox was exploding with messages. Half of them were from her editor, and the other half were from people who had apparently noticed that she'd vanished off the grid for a day. Her articles were overdue. A brand was threatening to withdraw from a partnership. Rent was still looming. Reality didn't care who she had spent the night talking to, but neither did she, at least not in the same way anymore. She answered every email, opened her half-finished blog post, and began to type. Her fingers moved faster than she thought possible. The words that poured out of her weren't just routine updates or sponsor content. There was something else entirely. Raw, honest, as if she'd scraped them from some hidden corner of her soul. An hour later, the post went live. What happens when you show someone the real you? It wasn't explicitly about Ethan, but it explored the themes of vulnerability, personal boundaries, and how easily one could become a manufactured version of themselves simply to survive, and how utterly terrifying it was to dismantle that carefully constructed facade. Her readers responded almost immediately. Messages flooded in, along with supportive comments and shares. Something profound had clearly been unlocked. That night, she didn't expect to hear from him. He had his vast empire to manage. She had her rent and her seemingly endless supply of ramen noodles. That's just how things had to be. But at 9:07 p.m., her phone vibrated. Still hungry, Ava stared at the screen, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Ava, always." The reply came seconds later. "My driver's outside. Let's destroy some takeout." And just like that, it became their routine. No pressure, no extravagant declarations of love, just stolen nights and shared takeout boxes. Two people sitting cross-legged on the floor of a billionaire's penthouse, devouring cheap Thai food, and talking as if the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. Ethan never made her feel insignificant, and Ava never allowed him to forget the world he had left behind to build his empire. It was a delicate balance, a strange and fragile tension, but it felt undeniably real. But fragile things are prone to breaking. It happened on a Thursday. Ava had just wrapped up a pitch meeting when her phone began to ring. It was her dad calling, which was unusual. He never called her during the day. She answered immediately, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Hey, is everything okay?" His voice sounded strained. "Cass, I just got a call from some guy with a British accent. Said his name was Ethan Ward." Ava's blood ran cold. "He asked if I was your father." Her dad continued, oblivious to her inner turmoil. Said he wanted to have a point of contact in case anything ever happened. Said he's the kind of guy who doesn't let people he cares about fall without anyone knowing. Ava struggled to breathe. "He didn't say anything weird," her dad added, his tone softening slightly. "Just that he sees something in you, and whatever you're doing, I should be proud." Ava sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Her chest trembled, not with fear, but with the overwhelming realization of how a single phone call could completely rearrange the landscape of her world. "He didn't have to do that," her dad said. "But he did. That says something." Ava swallowed hard. "Yeah," she whispered. "It does." But the initial swell of pride quickly morphed into a wave of panic. Because the more real things became between them, the closer Ava realized she was to losing control, not of Ethan, but of herself. This was no longer just a charming, improbable love story. This was the part where hearts inevitably broke. Ava hadn't realized how close she was to the precipice until the universe gave her a very good reason to look down. The call from her dad had unlocked something deep within her. Not fear. Ava was accustomed to surviving fear, but something far more dangerous. Hope. And that, more than anything else, terrified her. The next time she saw Ethan, everything felt different. Not because he had changed. He greeted her at the door with the same quiet confidence, the same unreadable gaze, as if he were always 10 steps ahead while remaining completely focused on her. But now she was paying closer attention, noticing the subtle nuances she had previously missed, noticing how he consciously moved slower when she was in the room, how he consistently ensured that she had enough to eat, how he actively listened, really listened. Even when she was rambling about impending deadlines and a broken kitchen faucet, he wasn't trying to impress her or offer unsolicited advice. He was genuinely trying to understand her, and she didn't know how to handle that. That night, as they sat on the couch sharing a pint of pistachio gelato, Ava abruptly set her spoon down. "Why did you call my dad?" Ethan held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because I wanted him to know you weren't alone." Ava's heart clenched. "That wasn't your place." He didn't flinch or back down. "Maybe not, but I made it my place." She looked away, unsure how to reconcile her emotions with his actions. "You scare me," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Not in a bad way, but in a way that makes me forget to keep things separate. And that's never happened before." Ava didn't know what to say, so she chose to remain silent. She simply leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. This time, it wasn't an accidental gesture. This time, it was a conscious decision, driven by a deep and overwhelming need for connection. The moment stretched out, slow and deliberate, quiet and profound, real and terrifying, but peace never seemed to last long in Ava's life. The next morning, her phone exploded with notifications. Not from work-related sources, but from every corner of the internet. Her latest blog post, "What Happens When You Show Someone the Real You," had been picked up by a major news outlet. Then a lifestyle website, and finally a celebrity gossip site that had clearly done their research. The headlines weren't exactly flattering. Blogger caught cozying up to billionaire Ethan Ward, who is the real Ava Bennett. From the subway to the penthouse, did Ava Bennett hustle her way to power? The accompanying photos were even worse. Blurry, zoomed-in shots of her entering Ethan's building, leaving his car, and laughing over dinner. One particularly invasive shot even showed her resting her head on his shoulder on the train, the very moment she had felt completely safe and oblivious to being observed. Her stomach churned with a familiar anxiety. This was no longer just a personal story. This was rapidly escalating into a full-blown media war. She immediately tried to call Ethan, but her call went unanswered. She tried again, only to be directed straight to voicemail. Panic began to claw its way up her throat, constricting her breathing. Was he already distancing himself? Had she already become a liability, something to be disposed of? She was halfway to packing her laptop and fleeing when her phone finally rang. "Ethan," she answered breathlessly, her voice laced with anxiety. "I didn't leak anything." "I know," Ethan said calmly, his voice reassuring. "Meet me." "Where?" He gave her an address. It wasn't a trendy restaurant. It wasn't his opulent penthouse. It was a private rooftop overlooking the sprawling city. When she arrived, the wind was fierce, and the sky was streaked with dramatic twilight colors. Ethan stood alone, his hands tucked into his pockets, gazing out at the horizon as if he were anticipating an approaching storm. She didn't speak. She simply stood beside him silently. Finally, he turned to face her. "You okay?" Ava gave a bitter laugh, laced with sarcasm. "Do I look okay?" Ethan studied her intently. "No, you look like someone about to run." "Maybe I will." "Why?" "Because this is too much," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Because I didn't sign up for this. I'm not your PR project, Ethan. I'm not your charity case." His jaw tightened, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Is that what you think this is?" "I don't know what this is." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Then let me make it crystal clear. You're not secret, you're not temporary, and you're not disposable." Ava held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Then why didn't you call me back?" "I was meeting with my legal team," he said simply, "to address whoever is leaking this information to the press." Ava stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude swirling within her. "You're serious?" "I don't play games, Ava." The wind whipped through her hair, but she hardly noticed. All she could see was the man standing before her. Solid, calm, unwavering in his support. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Neither do I," he admitted honestly. "But maybe we can figure it out together." For the first time, she didn't flinch or shy away from the word. Together. Ava stood at the back of the bustling newsroom, watching the editor's monitor as article after article about her and Ethan flooded the web. Each headline twisted the truth just enough to inflict a fresh sting. Every photograph had been taken without her knowledge or consent. Her privacy wasn't simply invaded, it was being devoured by the insatiable media. But the situation was evolving. They weren't just targeting her anymore. They were launching attacks against Ethan, and even worse, attempting to undermine her integrity. On the other side of the office's glass wall, Ethan was pacing as he engaged in a tense phone call with his legal counsel, maintaining his characteristic composure. But she now knew him well enough to recognize the subtle signs of stress, the tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible clenching of his jaw. He was simultaneously holding the entire world at bay and fiercely protecting her, and Ava realized she was done with being protected. It was time to fight back. That afternoon, she stormed into Olivia Park's office and firmly shut the door behind her. "I want to do an interview." Live with full creative control. Olivia Park blinked, clearly surprised by her sudden assertiveness. "You sure?" "Because once you go public, There's no turning back. Ava nodded resolutely. Exactly. It's time they heard the truth directly from me. 2 days later, Ava sat across from a camera crew in a quiet, professional studio. The interviewer, known for her ability to make even the most seasoned public figures crumble under pressure, leaned forward with her signature, disarming smile. Ava Bennett, blogger, New York dreamer, and now, the woman at the center of this year's most unexpected love story. Tell us, how does a girl from Queens end up in the arms of a billionaire? Ava smiled calmly and met her gaze directly. By falling asleep on the subway. The interviewer laughed, momentarily caught off guard by her candor. But the truth is, Ava continued, her voice becoming more serious. None of this was planned. Not the initial meeting, not the subsequent friendship, and definitely not falling in love with someone whose world is so vastly different from mine that it might as well exist on another planet. What about the rumors? The interviewer pressed, eager to delve into the more sensational aspects of the story. Ava looked directly into the camera, her expression unwavering. Ethan Ward didn't offer me a job. He didn't shower me with lavish gifts. He didn't rescue me from anything. If anything, he challenged me to grow and evolve. He believed in me, even when I had forgotten how to believe in myself. That's not manipulation. That's love. The studio fell silent. Even the usually restless tech crew paused their movements, captivated by her words. And yes, Ava said softly, her voice filled with emotion, I love him. Not because he's wealthy. Not because he wields immense power, but because he's genuinely kind, because he listens to me without judgment, because he makes me feel like I can be more than the world expects from a girl like me. The next morning, the video went viral, racking up over 5 million views and tens of thousands of comments. The majority of the responses were overwhelmingly supportive, although some predictably expressed skepticism and negativity. But the tide had undeniably turned. Ava Bennett was no longer just a scandalous headline. She was a compelling story, a real story. Her own story. That night, Ethan texted her a single line, "Meet me where it all started." Ava didn't need to ask for clarification. She understood immediately. She stood on the same subway platform where their unlikely journey had begun. The evening crowds bustled around her, and the wind whipped through her coat. She glanced around, her heart pounding with anticipation. Then she saw him. Ethan was standing in the exact spot where she had first unintentionally fallen asleep on his shoulder. But this time, he wasn't holding a book. He was holding a small, vintage-looking speaker. He pressed play, and a soft jazz melody filled the air. The platform wasn't entirely silent, but the atmosphere had been subtly transformed. People slowed their pace, turned their heads, and watched with curiosity. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Ava Bennett," he said, his voice clear and strong enough for only her to truly hear amidst the surrounding noise. "The first time I met you, you were asleep, and my initial thought was, this woman has no idea she's placing her trust in a complete stranger. But the truth is, I was the one who was unaware. I had no idea that the woman I encountered that day would completely change the course of my life." Ava held her breath, tears welling up in her eyes. "You reminded me of what it felt like to be authentic, to be vulnerable, to be unafraid of exposing my true self. You make me want to set aside all the superficial aspects of my life and simply hold your hand. And that's a lesson that no amount of money could ever have taught me." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a small velvet box. Ava's heart stopped beating for a brief moment. He didn't get down on one knee, not yet. Instead, he slowly opened the box, revealing a ring so elegant and understated it could. She could only have been chosen by a man who truly understood her heart. "I don't want to just keep you locked away in some penthouse," Ethan declared, his voice full of sincerity. "I want to build a real life with you, no matter where that may be." And with that, he lowered himself to one knee, a ring box appearing seemingly out of thin air. "So, Ava Bennett," he began, his eyes locked on hers, "will you do me the honor of marrying me and promise to never, ever fall asleep on another man's shoulder again?" Ava burst into laughter, tears freely flowing down her cheeks now, a mixture of joy and disbelief. She didn't need a moment to ponder. Her heart already knew the answer. Yes, she breathed, almost a whisper at first, then louder, clearer, for everyone present to hear. Yes. The crowd around them exploded in cheers and applause, a joyous wave of sound washing over them. Some people were openly cheering, while others dabbed at their eyes, overcome with emotion. But Ava saw only Ethan, her accidental billionaire, the man who had consistently been there for her in the most surprising and heartwarming ways. In that single, shining moment, she understood completely. Some love stories don't begin with dramatic declarations or extravagant displays. Some begin with heavy eyelids and a borrowed shoulder, and the bravery it takes to awaken to the possibility of something completely new. This was their story, and it was really only just beginning to unfold. And that's precisely how a sleepy moment, a chance encounter on a stranger's shoulder, blossomed into a love story that neither of them could have possibly predicted. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Your time and attention truly mean the world to us. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for many more unforgettable stories that are on their way. If this story resonated with you on a personal level, please don't hesitate to show your support and appreciation by clicking the like button and subscribing to our channel. We're really looking forward to bringing you more films, emotionally powerful dialogue, and stories that leave a lasting impression, the kind you cherish and remember for a long time. We hope we can count on your continued enthusiastic support and encouragement.